This is They Create Worlds, episode 257, 9 Atari games.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality, you'll find me there.
Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex.
Hello.
You would think, after so many episodes talking about Atari, we would be done with it. We've done the history of the brand, we've done all sorts of crazy things about the Great Cassar, we've done stuff about the crash and how it wasn't their fault, but it was their fault, but then it is their fault, and then how we think of the crash is not their fault. It's all crazy. Go check out those episodes. Here we are again, Alex, talking about Atari because apparently there's something we missed.
Well, you know, Jeffrey, I mean, we've talked about their general history. We've talked about their corporate shenanigans. We've talked about the crash. We've talked about their CEO. You know what we haven't talked about all that often if you get right down to it?
What?
Their games.
So you're telling us we never did play our Ataris at all in the last, I don't know how many episodes.
Something like that. Obviously, in our Atari history episodes, we've talked about some specific games. I'm being a little facetious. We did a whole episode on Ed Log and all of the fine coin-op and occasional console games that he did with Atari and Atari games. So I'm being slightly facetious, but no, we have not spent a great deal of time on the actual output of Atari, particularly in the old days. Of course, part of that is because a lot of their older output, I mean, the very early output, is very simple. You couldn't fill a whole episode with it. So you have to do something that's a little themed. Kind of in the same vein as our Activision games episode, where we just did a whole episode where we went through a bunch of different Activision games. We're going to do something similar with Atari here, except we're going to limit ourselves just to the games that were available when the system launched in 1977, which is a decent number. There were 9 of them. They're simple games. Don't worry, this isn't going to be a 9-hour episode or a 10-part episode because we're doing so many games. They're all very simple games. We can, without any irony, we can truly do that in a single episode. That seems to be a great way to start unlocking some of these Atari games. Just kind of go over what was there at the beginning and how it came about and how that spoke to what the console market was like in those early days.
I guess there's nothing to it but to go for the Atari equivalent of the Nintendo Black Box launch titles. Are you going to do this in alphabetical order or something?
Well, I think we'll probably do it in part number order. So the Atari VCS, it was called the VCS at launch. People know that later on it was called the 2600. That's because that was the part number. It was the CX2600 was the official catalog number within Atari. So all of the early games counted up from that, CX2601, CX2602, etc., etc. So that seems like the logical way to go through them. One final note that I do want to call out is there is a YouTube channel / website that goes into way more depth on the Atari library than anyone else, myself included. And that is the Atari Archive. Atari Archive's a YouTube channel. AtariArchive.org is the website where the blog is. That's my good friend Kevin Bunch who does that. We're going to be scratching the surface of these 9 games. If you really want to get deep on these and all the rest of the Atari 2600 catalog, he's not through the whole thing yet, but he's somewhere in 1981 now, I think, or 82, 83. I do watch them. He just hasn't released one in a while. So if you're listening, but he's going through the entire catalog and he does really deep dives on each of the games. I'll be cribbing from him as kind of a refresher. I'm not just parroting what he says. It's just an easy way to organize the information. And if you want more information, I urge you to check out his YouTube channel and his website.
At least that makes the show notes easy.
Yes, indeed. The whole show notes should really just be a link to his website and a link to the videos for each individual game. And, whatever random tangents we go on about or any past episodes we reference. But yeah.
Already done.
Indeed.
So, starting off our top 9 list, we have CX2601.
Combat. Classic. But before we get into combat, I do want to talk about a couple of things in general about the Atari VCS and the launch of the VCS. This isn't history of the system. We've talked about the system before. I don't know that we've done an episode dedicated to the system, but in all of our various History of Atari episodes, we've certainly talked about the genesis of the system. So we're not going to rehash the whole development of it, but we want to keep a couple of things in mind here. First of all, we have to remember that we are dealing with somewhat primitive technology here. For the time, it was fairly impressive for the home. It was outshining a lot of its competitors. But in order to do that, they had to cut corners in other areas, and they really, really couldn't afford to put much memory in it. We've talked about this in earlier episodes, but this is a system that had 128 bytes of memory. That's not a misspeak. 128 bytes of memory.
Considering that most standard ASCII characters take up 1 byte, that's 128 characters.
Indeed. Now, it did have fairly sophisticated graphics for the time being 1977. Obviously, the Intellivision will come out in a couple of years and have even more sophisticated graphics, but at a cost of $250, while the VCS will officially retail for $190 on launch and will often be seen at much lower prices out in the real world, as low as $170 at launch. But it does have pretty sophisticated graphics for the time. It has a solid graphics chip in there, and the way it's able to do that is it doesn't have a frame buffer. Generally speaking, at the time when you had a video display, that would be created as an entire frame. So in memory, you would draw a frame that makes up the entire screen, and the memory of that would be depended on the resolution, how many pixels there were, and then how many colors you had or whatever. So you would draw an entire screen in memory and then put that on the screen, and then the next screen would be drawing in the frame buffer while that screen's on there, and so on and so forth, which requires a lot of video RAM. In the Atari VCS, they are drawing by scanline. They've synced the graphics to the vertical sync of the screen, and they're not using a frame buffer. They're just always updating in real time. It makes it a very difficult system to program for, but it also means that you don't need a lot of memory to get a lot on the screen, and that's kind of a big deal. That'll come up a couple of times in these early games, just the way that they draw the screen like that. We're not going to get into all of the specifications, but just to keep that in mind. The other thing is that when this was being developed in 1975, 1976, finally comes out in 1977, but they're looking at it as early as 75. This is a system that they're starting to develop while the dedicated console market, which we've talked about in other episodes, is still ongoing. At this time, nobody really knows what a console cycle is. They don't know how long these systems are going to be viable. They don't know what the future is going to bring, what capabilities you need to plan for. There's no roadmap for doing this. So with the VCS, they actually took a fairly conservative approach, again, in part to keep costs down, which is they really only made it to be capable of playing Atari's biggest hits at the time. That time being 1975, 1976. So at that time, you had Pong, simple enough, as well as their 4-player variant, Quadra Pong. You had Grand Track 10, the racing game, one of the earliest driving games. Then you had the one-on-one dueling style games, Tank and Jet Fighter, which are in many ways the same thing, except Tank takes place on land in a maze and Jet Fighter's between planes in the sky. There's some other differences, but the basic conceit of each player controlling a vehicle and trying to shoot at the other player. Those were the big hits. They had some other games that had varying degrees of success, but those were the ones they wanted to make absolutely sure this system could play. So the entire graphical setup of this thing was really designed to be able to play those games, which is why it has a very limited number of what we would today call sprites and what they called back then player missile graphics. You had a low resolution background that you could kind of draw on two halves of the screen, so you could do some mirroring stuff for some variety there, but there was not a lot that you could do with the background. It was very low res. Then you had only 5 of these player missile graphics. It was basically 2 larger sprites. We'll use the term sprite because it's just less of a mouthful than player missile graphics, even though they didn't use the term sprite back then. You had 2 sprites for player objects, like tanks or race cars or whatever. You had 2 sprites for missiles, things that these player objects may be shooting. Then you had 1 very tiny sprite that was meant to be a ball, like in a ball and paddle game like Pong. That's all the sprite generation the system could do. Everything else had to be done through background graphics or through clever tricks, some of which I believe we've talked about in the past and a little bit of which we'll talk about in this episode here. That's kind of the limitations of this system, and it was really just meant to be able to play this very narrow range of games because they figured they might be doing another one of these in 2 years. They didn't know. In fact, their original plan was to do one about 2 or 3 years after this one released, and through circumstances that morphed into the Atari 8-bit computer line, the 400 and the 800. In some ways, it wasn't a very forward-thinking system, but in other ways, it ended up being incredibly versatile because to keep costs down, they didn't hard code into the hardware a lot of capability, and so you could do a lot in software if you were very good at counting your cycles. Final thing, we talked about the 128 bytes of memory in the system. The cartridges, all of the original cartridges, were only 2 kilobyte, 2K cartridges. So there's 128 bytes of RAM, and there's only 2K of ROM, which means that the early games had to be especially compact and primitive as well. They eventually move up to 4K cartridges, which is technically the maximum that the system can address, again, for cost reasons. They do for a few games later on. They develop a bank switching technique that lets them unlock even more memory in that, and there are a small number of 8K cartridges. Even though 4K becomes the norm within a couple of years, everything in this initial release is 2K. So very, very itty-bitty tiny, Jeffrey.
These days, people think that 2 gigabytes is small.
Indeed. What a world we live in. The other thing that I want to talk about before we get into the individual games is because the VCS was coming out of this dedicated console market, there was kind of this idea at the time that when you bought a dedicated console, which of course you couldn't expand, I mean, small number of them had interchangeable cartridges, but even then you're not really expanding what's on the hardware. It's not ROM memory interfacing with a CPU. The idea is when you buy this console, that is your entire purchase. As a result, there was a need to put multiple games in those consoles, which were usually just variations on a theme, and that theme was usually ball and paddle. We have ball and paddle episodes. We have a million of them. Jeffrey can find some of those to put in the show notes if he so desires. Not rehashing that, but I just want to mention that idea of multiple game selectability that both the Magnavox Odyssey had with its circuit cards and that the wave of dedicated consoles had in 75, 76, going into 77 was something that was reflected in the design of the VCS as well. Because these are simple games, as I said, 2K cartridges. Even though you can do interchangeability, even though every time you get a new game, you're not paying $50, $70, $100 for a whole new console, you are still spending $20 to buy a 2K cartridge. And the games of the time, pre-Space Invaders, just aren't that complicated. Most of them are coin-operated derivatives. And of course, coin-operated games are meant to just be little time wasters that you play for 60 to 90 seconds on a quarter. Before Space Invaders, in most of them, there wasn't a lot going on, even before Breakout. I mean, Breakout's out. It came out in 76, but very few games have anything of consequence going on, especially since the VCS is focusing on the hits of 72 to 75 and less even on the slightly more sophisticated games coming out in 76, 77, like a Breakout. So if you were just to put, say, Tank on a cartridge, that would be a really, really simple, really, really gets old fast game, and people would very quickly be like, why did I spend $20 on this? So the answer to that was to take an approach that was very similar to what dedicated consoles did, which is to have multiple games, he says in air quotes, on a single cartridge. Then there were actually a couple of toggle switches on the VCS that directly changed the gameplay they were using. One of these was a difficulty slider, or rather 2 difficulty sliders, one for each player, which could toggle between an easy mode and a hard mode. We'll talk about that in relation to some specific games as we go along. The other was the game selector, which allowed you to flip through a bunch of different game modes. On some of these cartridges, those game modes will just be very subtle differences. On a couple of the cartridges, there are actually very different games on the same cartridge on these early games, though obviously all based on the basic kernel that was used to create the primary game, so they can't get too wild and crazy with it. So you'll see on all these Atari games, especially these early ones, they'll be advertising that there are X number of video games included, and it'll usually be a pretty big number. Really, what it is there are about 4 or 5 variants, and then there are some ways to mix and match across those variants that give you other variants. So it's not really all that many separate games, but it's still more variety than just having a single basic arcade game on that VCS system. With all those caveats out of the way, we can finally turn our attention to that first entry, CX2601, which is Combat. Combat, which is very clear from the box, even if less so from the name, basically is the adaptation of Tank, which was the classic 1974 Key Games one-on-one dueling game that sold well over 10,000 units, helped end distributorship exclusivity in the coin-op business, and was, at the time, just about the most fun you could have in a multiplayer video game as you and a friend or a frenemy were navigating a tank through a maze, which could also have landmines in it as additional dangerous obstacles, and trying to score hits on your opponent for points. Of course, this was one of Atari's biggest hits, came out Key Games, as anyone who's listened to our million Atari episodes know. That was a secret and then not-so-secret subsidiary of Atari, so it's still an Atari game. It's one of their absolute biggest hits, so there was no doubt that it would be one of the main games that they created. Since it was a little more complicated than, say, Pong, in terms of the objects on the screen at any given time, it was also basically their test bed as they were creating the system. Even when they were doing the wire-wrapped prototype, before they even had the chips done, as Steve Mayer and Ron Milner, the two gentlemen at Cyan Engineering who started the design of the VCS, as they were creating the system, they were creating Tank/Combat in parallel with the creation of the system because it was the best way to test out that everything's working. It was going to make more sophisticated use of the backgrounds because you needed mazes. It was going to use 4 of the 5 player missile graphics. This is the earliest game that was created for the system, and it kept getting refined over time as the system kept getting defined. Once Joe DeCure was hired to help debug the system, he spent some time as well working on the Tank game a little bit, but then it ultimately was handed off to the third person who was a member of the internal Atari team that worked on turning the VCS from Cyan's wire-wrapped prototype into final system, which is Larry Wagner, a mathematician who had joined the company after he and Al Alcorn had gotten to know each other. So Wagner was the first head of the programming group once there were more programmers than just him and sort of Joe DeCure, who was focused on hardware, but also did a little programming. But at this point, he's kind of the first guy that's dedicated primarily to getting game stuff to work. Throughout 1976, he's working on getting a few different things together in a single prototype cartridge. Basically, all of those hits that I talked about before that they were working towards being able to play, which is, as I said, Pong, Quadra Pong, Grand Track 10, Tank, Jet Fighter. His original program that he was working on, and a lot of his notes have been scanned and preserved. Kevin Bunch played a big role in that. So that's how we know a lot of this stuff is from Larry Wagner's own notes from the time. The original version that he was looking at making was actually a combination of Pong and a racing game and Tank, presumably because all of those concepts had been prototyped a little bit by Mayer and Milner, and they probably just handed over all of their prototype information to Wagner's, like, here's what we've been working on, good luck. Obviously, it didn't make sense long-term to keep all of that stuff together. very quickly that was separated out, and Wagner continued with the tank concept, and the racing and ball and paddle stuff were moved on to other cartridges. Wagner is the one, though, that basically started the trend of adding all sorts of variants to games. This is what makes Combat one of the most interesting games on the system, and a real banger to play, even in the present day, quite frankly. I mean, it's no GoldenEye or whatever the latest Call of Duty the kids are playing is, but I know you have a VCS, Jeffrey, that you didn't have as a kid, but that you inherited as an adult. And I know that you have Combat on that VCS, and you've had a little bit of fun with that here and there, haven't you?
I've played it a couple times, but you kind of have to have another person to play it with. It's kind of hard to have the left hand fight the right hand.
Very true. But it is a fun little multiplayer game because Tank is kind of fun in and of itself. I mean, there's a maze. You're maneuvering your player through the maze and trying to hit the other player. But then the variants that he added to it were very fascinating. The box says there's 27 video games in this thing. Of course, there's not really that many video games, but he was very generous in the variants that he packed with it. First of all, one thing that's very interesting is he made good use of the difficulty switches for player 1 and player 2 for the game. The player difficulty switches are just on-off toggle switches, like there's an A and a B. You don't cycle through difficulties in the same way that you can cycle through game modes. Basically, the switches were used to set the range of the shots of the player's tanks or airplanes in those variants. So the interesting thing about that is it created a nice little handicapping system. Because if you had two players that were of uneven skill, you could force the better player to have to get closer to the other player before his shots will hit. So it's a nice little handicapping feature, which was a kind of cool thing to do. Then the game toggle switch allowed you to go through a wide variety of interesting modes. All of them have one thing in common, which is that the game will be about 2 minutes and 16 seconds in length, 2 players required, and at the end of that 2 minutes, 16 seconds, whoever has the most points wins. But there are several variations to this. The tank ones are particularly interesting. He came up with the fun idea of what he basically called tank pong, which is that instead of the traditional way where you fire a shot and if it hits a wall, it just impacts with the wall and nothing happens, in tank pong, pong tank, whatever, the shots bounce off the walls. So they will ricochet all over the place. So you can try to hit the other player, which adds a real interesting layer of strategy to the game that the simplicity of the game you wouldn't necessarily think would be there. Then he took it a step further and created a variant that was what he called kind of a billiard-style Pong, which is your shots could only destroy the other player's tank if they bounced off a wall first. So if you just shot the tank head on, it would pass right through. You actually had to bounce your shot off the wall to hit the other player. And that gave the game a certain freshness and a certain level of interest that made it a really fun multiplayer game to play, even in the later years of the VCS as some of the other games became more sophisticated. You know, most of the 9 launch titles for this system were outclassed within a few years as people learned new tricks of how to program the system, as cartridge sizes got larger. Most of these early games were forgotten as new and improved driving games or shooting games or whatever type of games came out. But Combat, which was also the pack-in game for the system for most of its history, and certainly at launch, retained a certain level of fun that the other early launch titles didn't. And a big part of that was because of those bouncing bullet variants that it had. And then, of course, it also had the airplane variants. There were a couple of different types. There was just a simple one-on-one dueling style game, very reminiscent of Jet Fighter. There was one where it's big airplanes versus small airplanes. Then there was also the option to have clouds on the screen, which would provide a little more tactical interest because you could fly into a cloud and then you were invisible. And these were pretty large clouds because the background is very low resolution. These 2 clouds took up a decent amount of the center of the screen, and you could try to use those to surprise the other player because he won't know where you're coming back out on the other side. So again, trying to add a little more strategy to the straightforward one-on-one dueling than was necessarily available in the original version. Yeah, overall, a pretty darn solid game when you consider the limitations of the VCS generally.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you. It's something that you did not see with a lot of VCS games. Usually it was just the game and then a little bit of harder difficulty where it was faster, more something on the screen, some sort of handicap for yourself to make it harder. But it didn't have this degree of variety or engagement.
Absolutely. So that's our first title, and the pack-in game, at least when you bought it almost everywhere, because there were also Sears exclusive versions of the Atari VCS and the early Atari VCS games. The only thing that's different about them is that they have different specific Sears branded names. The Sears Telegames system for the base console, and then the early games, they changed this later, but the early games had different names. And at some point, there were a couple of games that were Sears exclusives, but none of the launch titles were Sears exclusives. Combat, which in Sears was known as Tank Plus, was the pack-in everywhere except Sears. Sears decided to pack in another game with their Sears Telegames system, presumably in order to entice people to want to buy from them instead of buying from someplace else, though really they got the raw end of the deal because it's not quite as good a game. And that game is CX2602 Air Sea Battle, or as Sears called it, in its bundled form, Target Fun. A note here on release dates before we go into the other games. The Atari VCS seems to have made its way into a nationwide release in the United States in September 1977. There's plenty of evidence that, at least in California, it was available in the month of August 1977, because back in those days, street dates weren't a thing. Retailers, when they got product, they just went ahead and put it out. And the idea of getting all of your inventory shipped in advance of your launch date was also not a thing. They were basically making them and shipping them and getting them out as fast as they could. California got theirs first because Atari's in California and the factory's in California, and so that's not a long ways to go. Then in other parts of the country, it didn't trickle out until September because that's when they finally started getting them. And I think September was as close to an official launch date as you can get, or launch month you can get for the system. But the system was originally available in August. In advance of the system coming out, when early advertisements started appearing, only the first 5 games were advertised in the early newspaper articles. We do know from Weekly Television Digest and some of the reporting around Atari launching the system that all 9 games were available at launch, despite the fact that the early newspapers only advertise a handful of them. But we also know from reports in that magazine that it took a little longer for all of the other cartridges to show up. The system showed up in August and early September. The other cartridges didn't start showing up until about late September at the earliest. And because of the way shipping works, some places might not have gotten them even until a little later after that. So back in that day, what would happen in those cases is there may have been some mail order business, and there were probably some stores that took your name down and essentially a kind of unofficial pre-order. But it did take a little bit of time for the games to roll out. But by the end of September, they were shipping all 9 games, the pack-in game plus the 8 sold separately, though I wouldn't be surprised if some places didn't get them until October. So with that out of the way, we turn our attention back to Air Sea Battle, or Target Fun. This game was programmed by the first person hired into the programming group, Larry Kaplan, who was also one of the almost co-founders of Activision. He was going to found Activision with 3 other programmers, ended up chickening out and then changing his mind and coming back 2 months later. He's often called a co-founder. He's not technically a co-founder, but we talk about him in our Activision episode, so we don't have to really go into his background other than to note that he was the first programmer hired. Wagner was running the programming group, and he programmed the combat game, but doing the in the trenches programming wasn't really his day-to-day. He was just doing that as part of the initial VCS development. Kaplan was the first person hired to specifically be and now you're making games. In these early days, for the most part, games were not assigned by management. The early programmers were given some freedom in what they chose to do for their launch titles. However, they were strongly encouraged to look at Atari's current catalog of arcade games coin-op games and focus on porting some of those games over. The same strategy that we see for decades after. Have a hit in the arcade and then bring it home where people already know about it and you have some built-in marketing around it. So for his first game, Kaplan chose the 1975 Atari coin-op game Anti-Aircraft. Anti-Aircraft was just a very, very simple target shooting game. 1 or 2 players control a gun battery at the bottom of the screen in a fixed location. You can change the elevation of the gun, but you can't move the gun around. Targets, aeroplanes and whatnot, start appearing across the top of the screen, and it is your job to shoot them down for the points. Very simple, very straightforward game. And one that mostly works well for the Atari VCS. 2 players, each shooting 2 bullets. The problem is the targets, because you have to have a target-rich environment for a game like this to be in any way interesting, and we have a system that can only generate 5 sprites, 4 of which belong to the players and their projectiles. However, as Larry Kaplan approached this problem, and I think we probably talked about this in other episodes, he was saved on creating a more interesting game by the way the system draws the graphics. Because as we may recall, the graphics are drawn a scan line at a time, which means that the system is not housing in memory what the screen looks like. It is literally just taking that CRT, that beam of electrons coming out of the CRT, and pointing it at a line of the screen, and then pointing it at the next line of the screen. And what's in the previous lines or what's in the coming lines, the system doesn't even know because it's just being given its instructions line by line. It's not a frame buffer. So that means what he discovered is, well, you can actually reuse sprites on different lines. As long as you're not using the same sprite on the same line twice, the system doesn't realize you're doing things you're not supposed to because it's not in memory. It's just like, okay, I've drawn a sprite on this line. Then by the time it gets to the next line, it has no idea what it did in the previous line. So then it's like, okay, now I'm drawing a sprite on this line. And before you know it, you can have a bunch of different objects on the screen. So you'll notice when you look at Anti-Aircraft in Kevin's videos that we'll put in the show notes or wherever else you want to look at it, you'll notice there are a lot of targets, but they're all coming out at different altitudes. None of them are on the same horizontal band. That's because he is using this very clever trick, which he named H-move, horizontal move, in order to get sprites on multiple lines. You just have to be very careful on the timing and when things update, and that all works out. Already, even with the very first set of games, we're seeing the VCS extended beyond the capabilities that the hardware engineers necessarily expected it to have. And we're already seeing some of that unique programming talent that meant that a few years later, when people were getting disgruntled and upset about lack of royalties and recognition, that there really were special skills involved, and that if you really knew what you were doing, you could go off and found your own Atari VCS software creation company with Blackjack and hookers, and make games that truly stood out in the marketplace. Air-Sea Battle, based on Anti-Aircraft, it's a fairly basic game. The objects don't shoot back at you. Before Space Invaders, it was very rare, very, very rare to have computer-controlled objects or hardware-controlled objects shoot back at you. It's a target shooting game. It's just like the coin-op game. There's gun batteries on either side of the screen. They can't move around the screen, but you can change their elevation, and then there are a bunch of targets coming at different altitudes. You're competing to shoot down the most targets for points. There is technically a one-player mode of this as well. He really did want to try to get some kind of primitive AI, for lack of a better term, in there. But he was so memory limited that basically when you play the one-player mode, it's just the other gun is just shooting off randomly at intervals. It doesn't really have any capability to track targets or shoot at targets. So it's probably one of the worst one-player modes ever invented for a video game, and Larry Kaplan would be the first to tell you that. Such was the state of 2K cartridges and 128 bytes of memory in 1977. Just as with Combat, and just as with all of the other games we're going to see, Kaplan did program variations. He saw what Wagner was doing with Combat, having multiple variations, and he was like, that makes a lot of sense. I'll do that too. So there are a few variants to keep it a little fresh. There's 3 different modes. There's the classic anti-aircraft mode where you can only change the elevation. Then there's a mode that is closest to the classic Midway video game Seawolf that we talk about in our Dave Nutting Associates episode, submarine target shooting game, where the elevation of the gun is fixed, but you can actually move the gun all around the screen, and you're taking shots at ships and mines that are at various depths on the ocean. And that is very, very similar to the Seawolf game. Then there's just a kind of free-range target shooting game. It's kind of a carnival-style shooting game, like a carnival shooting gallery type game where you're just shooting things of all sorts of different shapes. In that game, you can change both the elevation and move the gun around. So there's 3 basic variations there. There's also a couple of variations where instead of you being at the bottom of the screen, you are actually controlling one of the planes flying along the top of the screen and dropping bombs on targets that are beneath you as well. It's basically all of the types of target shooting games that people had come up with by this point. Not just anti-aircraft, but also Seawolf. There's a little bit of depth charge in there, though not quite as complicated, because in depth charge, you actually have to time when the explosions are going to be, and the bombing run modes of this game, you're just not having to time when things are going to explode. But, they've come up with these basic types of shooting games. You can be at the bottom of the screen, elevating your gun up and down. You can be at the bottom of the screen, moving your gun left and right. You can be at the bottom of the screen, being able to both elevate your gun up and down and move your gun left and right, or you can be at the top of the screen dropping bombs on things at the bottom of the screen. That was the state of target shooting in 1977. That was the state of target shooting for the most part, with a couple of exceptions, pre-Space Invaders. That's what you get in Air-Sea Battle / Target Fun. Is that one that you've played or that you had? I don't remember all the games that you have. I know you don't have all the launch titles.
No, I never played that one.
Combat's a better time, but it's not the worst game in the world.
I think Combat's the only launch title I have.
Yeah, and of course that was the pack-in, so people were still buying that one in 1982. Finally, later in 1982, Pac-Man replaced it as the pack-in. For the first several years of life, Combat was the game that everybody got. Yes, Target Fun was the bundled game with Sears, but not nearly as many people bought VCSs at Sears compared to people that bought VCSs everywhere else. A little less common in that sense. Now, at this point, the numbers remain somewhat sequential, but they don't go up in the same way. So next, we're going to jump up to CX2621, which is Video Olympics, which sounds like a very, very fancy kind of thing, but is actually just, let's put all of the ball and paddle games on a single cartridge. So it's Pong and the mini variants of Pong. This was the one game that was largely completed by Joe DeCure. Again, Joe DeCure, like Larry Wagner, was a member of the hardware team that helped develop the final version of the VCS. Unlike Wagner, who then went on to be the head of the programming group, DeCure continued to be a chip designer on later versions of Atari hardware. But since he was the one that was brought on to debug the original prototype and then help chipwiz Jay Miner develop the final chips for the final version of the VCS, as Wagner was tinkering with stuff, so was DeCure tinkering with stuff as they were just getting this system all together. As we said, Wagner had kind of started having everything on one cartridge, but at some point there, the whole Pong thing was put under the auspices of Mr. Joe DeCure, who obviously, in the same vein as everyone else is doing, is trying to get as many variants as possible. This one advertises a whopping 50 video games on the cartridge, which sounds like a lot, but of course, most of that is just...
I'm not even sure how you can get the switches into 50 combinations.
Well, when you count the different difficulty adjustments and then all of the different types of games, that's how it happens, basically. For instance, this one has another handicap-style difficulty slider, which is that the difficulty switch can change the size of the paddles on the game. Which, again, you can, a less adept player can have a bigger paddle to create a little bit of a handicap situation. So I'm sure when they're counting variants, they're also counting, and this person's paddle is big and this person's paddle is small. There are also variants that allow you to use the button on the controller. I should say that this game uses the system's paddle controller. The Atari VCS shipped with both joysticks and paddles. Paddles at the time being incredibly necessary for playing ball and paddle games, which were not all the rage anymore, but were still out there and were relatively easy to develop. So that has a button as well. So there were also variants that allowed you to use the button to hit the ball harder. There were also speed up variants that causes the ball to speed up quite a bit. So there's different ways that the physics work, different paddle sizes, and those kind of variations. And then you can apply those variations across all the game types. So, you have Pong with speed up. You have Pong with the whammy option, hitting the ball harder. You have Pong with both the speed up and the whammy option. See, I've just given you 3 games right there. 3 games right there. When they're advertising 50 games, they don't mean it in the sense that we would think of it today. They're talking about the way you can mix and match all of these different variations together. Of course, the nice thing about Video Olympics as well is the way Atari did the paddle controllers is each paddle controller is actually 2 paddle controllers. Like it has one plug into the system, and that one plug is linked to 2 paddle controllers, which is what allowed them to do 4-player games when you use the paddle controller. So unlike most of the other games using the joystick, which are 1 to 2 players, this has variants that can also be played by 4 players. They basically put in all the things they could think to do. It has Pong, classic Pong, Super Pong, which is still 2 players. It's just they're controlling multiple paddles all in a straight line, just because I guess more paddles is more exciting. The coin-op version, you had 3 paddles because this is the Atari VCS and there are only a limited number of sprites. In the VCS version, you control 2 paddles, but it's basically Pong, except there's another paddle behind the first one, so you have another chance to hit the ball if your first paddle doesn't get there. Not the most exciting variant in the entire world. Then there is Pong Doubles, which is just 4-player Pong. There's the classic Quadra Pong, also known as Elimination by Key Games, where you have 4 players each guarding a wall and trying to stop the ball from getting past them, and if the ball gets past them too often, they're eliminated from the game. Again, with those paddle controllers, you can do that. Foos Pong, I think, can have 3 paddles because they're stacked on top of each other vertically, which means they're each on a different horizontal line, which means you can use the H-move trick. Whereas the Super Pong variant, they had to take it down from 3 paddles to 2 paddles because those are horizontally stacked, which means they're moving vertically up and down the screen, and H-move will not save you. Then they had soccer, defending goals, handball, which is each player bouncing the ball off a wall and it returning to them, an ice hockey variant, basketball, which is where you're using parabolic arcs to try to get it into a hoop, volleyball, where you're using parabolic arcs to try to get it over the net. You can also do spikes in that one. So these are all variations, except for maybe the Foos Pong one. These are all variations that have either appeared in the arcade in the past or have appeared on past home Pong systems. So there's nothing particularly new, nothing particularly exciting about this one. It's just they're all thrown together onto a single cartridge. You're getting all of your ball and paddle fun out of the way on a single cartridge. Obviously, by 1977... not quite as exciting as it was in 1975, let alone 1972, so not a particularly noteworthy release, but you had to do it. You have to have Pong. It's the game that started it all for Atari. The Sears version of that one has the slightly more appropriate title of Pong Sports. All right, so those were the 3 kind of first things that came together. Wagner and DeCure on the hardware team created 2 of them. Kaplan, the first programmer, created the third one, Air-Sea Battle. Now we start to get into some of the games that were developed a little later in the process of developing the system, though, of course, they all came out at the same time. Our next game is CX2611. Forget all of that stuff about going in order. We're completely out of order now. It doesn't matter. CX2611 Indy 500. Indy 500 is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, it is the only game that cost more than the rest of the launch titles. It cost about double, more like $40 instead of $20, because it's the only game that came with its own pack-in controller. A specially modified driving controller that looks like it's a paddle. It looks like it's just a slightly taller version of the paddle controller that comes with the VCS. But in fact, the difference is that a typical paddle controller, you can move it left a certain amount and then it stops. You can move it right a certain amount and then it stops. It has a range of motion that is not a complete circle. The driving controller had a range of motion that was a complete circle. So you could just constantly spin this thing around to have your cars drive around a track. Obviously, having a real steering wheel controller would have been way too expensive and way too crazy for a video game system coming out in 1977. So they did the next best thing, which is had this round controller that you could just rotate endlessly as if you were turning a steering wheel in one direction, except you never have to reset it back to a neutral position. You can just keep turning it, and every time you twist it, it will be turning your car around. The other thing that's interesting about it is it was programmed by a guy who really had no business programming games, which is not an insult, but it was programmed by a guy named Ed Riddle, who was actually a hardware engineer at the company. He was interviewed a few years back by the Atari Compendium, so we have his story now. He was interviewed in 2017. Before that, we knew nothing about him. He was brought in to be a hardware guy. Then when he got there, they were like, well, we don't really have any specific projects for you right now. Why don't you just play around with stuff and see if you come up with something fun and interesting? And he was like, okay. So he was just kind of fooling around with some things. And then one of the other hardware guys was like, would you like to just try programming a game? This was a guy named Wade Tuma. Wade was just kind of like, you want to try programming a game? And Ed Riddle was like, sure. Why not? He'd never programmed before. He had no idea what he was doing, but we may recall that Larry Wagner had been working on a combination cartridge at the beginning that was combat and Pong and a racing game, essentially Grand Track 10, Atari's big hit racing game from 1974. So Larry Wagner was like, well, here, I've started work on this driving game. I'll give you this code, and you can start from there, and then maybe you can figure it out. So it had some table structure in place already for the graphics. It had some move routines already in place. There was a kernel, essentially. Though I don't know that it was called a kernel back then, which gave him a starting point, and then he kind of worked from there to figure out what he was doing. So this was, at its core, a take on Grand Track 10, that first Atari driving game, which we've talked about before. It's a single-screen overhead game. It's a game of maneuver because it's a very twisty racetrack. Has to be twisty, so you're making maximum use of that single screen, and you're trying to navigate all of those corners and get your car around the screen within the time limit kind of deal. Or, in the case of Indy 500, racing another player as well. So that special driving controller worked kind of well for it because you could spin that thing around and you could take those tight turns. Obviously, there's no acceleration that you have to worry about as you did in the actual arcade game and on later driving games because everything was too primitive for that. But it was mostly based on navigating turns, getting your car turned around, that kind of thing. Then, of course, he did offer some additional variations to go along with it, as they did with everything else. The standard game is a race against the clock, which is what the original Grand Track was, because it was a single-player game, or a race against another player who is also playing with a driving controller. First to finish 25 laps wins. There are two different tracks, so there's a little bit of variation there as well, which is why they can get the... Even though he really came up with only 4 variants, they could claim that there were 14 games on this cartridge. Next, there was a version called Crash and Score, which was another Atari coin-op game. Not one of their more well-known ones, but Crash and Score exactly as it sounds. You're driving a car around the screen. There are various objects on the screen that are worth varying numbers of points. Your job is to crash into those and score points. I don't know that in the VCS game they have different point values. I think they did in the coin-op game, though. This can be either done in a timed mode, where whoever has the most points after the time limit wins, or you can do it in a first person to 50 points wins. Next, there was a tag version, which was just a chase game. You're trying to catch the other car and run into it, with the goal being the first to reach 99 points. Again, you can play this on a couple of different play fields, so there are some obstacles in there as well. Kind of like a Mario Kart battle mode, I suppose, if the only way you could pop the other players' balloons in Mario Kart was by ramming into them. And they had 99 balloons. 99 Luftballoons. Anyway, the other version, the final version, is a very interesting one, was racing, but with ice physics. So the road basically has no traction, and you're skidding around. Kind of like playing Vanilla Lake in Mario Kart. We all remember playing Vanilla Lake in Mario Kart, don't we?
My therapist tells me not to bring that up.
But a very early period to have something as sophisticated as ice physics. And I mean, in terms of how much memory that takes up, it's not so much because you're just, changing a couple of variables, but not something common at the time. And of course, just about every driving game anymore has ice physics somewhere in it. They're not influenced by Indy 500. It's just ice is a logical, challenging terrain type to drive on, but nonetheless, a very early implementation of that. That was Indy 500. Not a very well-selling game compared to some of the others, as near as we can tell, because it was twice as expensive because of that controller. And then they never made another game that used that driving controller, which means they never released it in any other capacity. That controller just kind of faded completely into obscurity. Ed Riddle actually started on a second game that would have used the driving controller, one that involved smashing bugs, but he ended up moving on before he finished that. That would have been called Roach Wars. That was the working title, at least. But gaming wasn't actually his thing, so he never actually finished that and ended up moving on someplace else, and the driving controller was forgotten for all the rest of time. So that's Indy 500. Moving on, gets us to the other driving game that was released on the system.
Street Racer! It's like Ridge Racer, but worse.
That's right. Remember that one? CX2612 is the number. The game, as you said, is Street Racer. This was the second game created by the first programmer that was hired in, Larry Kaplan. Since Larry Kaplan was the first programmer hired in, he had a little more time than everybody else, so he actually is the only person that completed 2 games for the launch, as opposed to just 1. The reason this game exists, it's superficially similar to the other big racing hit of the time, which was Taito/Midway's Speed Race/Wheels. We've talked about that game in other episodes, but according to Kaplan, he wasn't influenced by that game, and that's believable because it doesn't really play all that similarly to Speed Race, even though it shares the basic ideas of overhead vertically scrolling, in some modes having to dodge other cars. But really the reason he did it is they were looking to try to find other games that could use the paddle controllers, because unlike the special driving controller, the paddle controller is actually shipped with the console, so you want people to get their money's worth out of it. So he was thinking to himself, what can I do with the paddle controllers other than ball and paddle games? And he came up with the idea that he could do an overhead driving game, because if you're just moving the car left and right, then you can turn the paddle left and right to do that. You don't need the full range of motion that a Grand Track style racing game needs. So that's why he did Street Racer. Originally, he was actually going to do Night Driver, which was Atari's 3D first-person racing game that had come out in 1976. According to Kaplan, he claimed someone else had dibs on it, and so he didn't get to do it. That seems kind of weird because Night Driver didn't actually come out on the Atari VCS until 1980. I don't think anyone probably had dibs on it at the time. Maybe he's misremembering. Maybe it's more complicated. Maybe somebody did try to start Night Driver and it didn't work out, so they just abandoned it. Who knows? But the point is, he was going to base it on the Atari arcade game Night Driver. That didn't work out, so he did this overhead racing game instead. So very much like Speed Race, you're driving down this straight road, and there are other vehicles and obstacles that you have to avoid. Several gameplay modes as well in this one. Once again, probably because of the way the Atari VCS timing works or whatever, most of these are timed competitions where they end after 2 minutes and 16 seconds. The game also ends if one of the two players gets 99 points, presumably because he doesn't want the score to roll over. So those are the two ways the games can end. The difficulty switches here, which again can serve as a handicap for a less experienced player as well, control whether you lose points or not when you collide. So on the harder difficulty mode, if you collide with something, you actually lose a point. A few different variants here. There is a computer opponent in this one. We may recall Kaplan tried to implement a computer opponent in air-sea battle as well. That didn't work so well. In this one, there is a computer opponent as well that you can race against. The scoring is based on passing cars. So as you drive up the screen, there are cars coming down the screen. Each car you pass is worth a point. If you have the hard difficulty on, hitting a car loses you a point. And then it's whoever has the most points after 2 minutes, 16 seconds, or whoever gets to 99 points first. There's also a team mode, because we may recall that the paddle controllers allow for up to 4 players. So you can actually have 2 players and multiple cars. Then there are a couple of other interesting variants. He did a skiing variant on this one, where instead of a car, you have a little skier. This variant's called Slalom, and there are gates representing the gates created by slalom flags on the slalom ski course, though obviously it's way too graphically primitive to accurately show something like that, like Activision's skiing game would several years later. But there are these basically giant background blocks that come across the screen, and then there's just a little gap in the block that you have to navigate your player through. So you get points by flying through the gates. The difficulty switch on this one not only causes you to lose points when you collide with the walls, but it also makes the gates narrower on the higher difficulty as well. This one can be played in team modes because 4 players with paddles. Then the next one is called Dodge 'em. Later on, there would be an actual Atari VCS game called Dodge 'em. This is not that. This is actually basically Atari's second coin-operated video game, Space Race. Except it's cars instead of spaceships because you don't want to introduce yet another graphic when you have so little memory. But in Space Race, Atari's 1973 game, each player controls a rocket ship at the bottom of the screen. They're trying to get to the top of the screen. They score a point each time they get to the top of the screen. There are asteroids coming at them from the side of the screen, and if they hit an asteroid, they're put back to the start of the screen without scoring a point. So you're trying to get to the top of the screen without hitting an asteroid. In this case, it's other obstacles. It's rocks, oil slicks, potholes rather than asteroids flying at you from the side. But it's the same idea. You're driving up the screen, trying to get to the top of the screen, score a point every time you make it. If you hit an obstacle, you're placed back at the bottom of the screen, and most points wins. Then there's a few really wild variations. Kaplan got very creative on this one. There's a variant called Jet Fighter, not to be confused with the Atari coin-op Jet Fighter or with the one-on-one dueling variants in the combat game. This one is a vertically scrolling shooter where you're controlling a fighter at the bottom of the screen. Planes are coming, and you have to try to shoot them down. They're not shooting back at you. Again, this is pre-Space Invaders. Your goal is to shoot down all the planes. If you miss a plane, you will either lose time or lose points, depending on your difficulty selection. Apparently, though, with the paddle controller and the limited screen real estate, this one's not a really hard game, so it's really not that interesting. Then there's one called Number Cruncher, where you're controlling motorcyclists, and there are random numbers bouncing down the track. You have to try to pick up the numbers, and they're worth the number of points that they are on the screen. If a 2 is hurtling down the screen towards you, it's worth 2 points, that kind of thing. Then there's one called Scoop Ball, 1 to 4 players, where you have a scoop on the front of your car, and there are balls, and you are trying to pick up the ball, which gets you 1 point, and then there are goals that appear, and if you get the ball in the goal, you score 3 points. It's kind of like Rocket League if Rocket League were you just driving forever in one direction, gathering balls and shooting balls. So not like Rocket League at all, but it could be. It could be. So yeah, just everything he could think of in obstacle avoidance while using a paddle controller and driving a car, maneuvering a skier vertically up the screen. That's our second driving game, Street Racer. And I should say that that game was called Speedway 2 in Sears, and I forgot to mention that Indy 500 was Race in Sears. So now we'll move on to our next game, which was definitely, in some ways, the most ambitious game of this initial set, though it doesn't necessarily completely hold together as a result, which is CX2603 Starship, which at some point in development must have been called Space Mission, because very early ads for the VCS don't call it Starship, they call it Space Mission. They're not calling it that because it's the Sears name. The Sears name is Outer Space. Starship was the first game created by Bob Whitehead, who was the second programmer brought in at the very beginning of 1977, also one of the co-founders of Activision, who we have talked about before. It is, in its basic form, because of course there are variants, a port of Atari's arcade game Starship 1, which had come out in 1977 and was a first-person perspective game. Whitehead thought that would be fun to try to figure out how to do on the VCS. Not exactly a system optimized, per se, for a 3D perspective, but our man did his best here at porting Starship 1 over to the VCS. The primary mode of the game is called Space Wars, which has nothing to do with Space War, but everything to do with Starship 1. Again, the time limit is 2 minutes, 16 seconds. I'm sure if you do the math on that, that time limit makes sense based on clock cycles and memory and all sorts of stuff. To destroy UFOs that come at you on the screen, they have different point values. You also have to avoid colliding with ships or asteroids, the asteroids being indestructible. There are some variations here that adjust how fast the objects move and whether they come at you in groups of 1 or groups of 2. Not that 1 is a group, but you know what I mean. The difficulty toggle is used on this one as well. It weakens the power of your missiles and makes the enemy ships more difficult to hit. This is a one-player game, so this is just to increase the difficulty for your own edification. It is not a handicap, because it was hard enough trying to vaguely do a 3D setup for a single player. They were certainly not going to do it for 2 players. The second main version on here is a game called Space Race, which confusingly is not at all like Atari's arcade game Space Race. Larry Kaplan, on his Street Race cartridge, did a game that was essentially Space Race. Whitehead called a game Space Race, but it's not the same at all. This is basically the exact same as the main version of the game. It's just that you can't shoot at the ships. You are just dodging them. You are traveling as far as you can within the time limit. Distance is measured in parsecs, so it's a number that increments slowly like a score, and collisions will cause you to lose these points. Finally, there is a game called Lunar Lander, which was probably loosely inspired by the classic Lunar Lander mainframe game, but doesn't play anything like it, because there's no way you're doing all of those sophisticated physics on an Atari 2600 in 1977. Instead, you are controlling a little blob that represents a lander. There's a moon floating around the screen because, yeah, that's what moons do. They just kind of float around on their own. You have to try to land up your little ship with the moon. It's not a game of physics and burning fuel like the computer games are, but it's probably inspired by the same concept. This actually has a 2-player mode, because the second player can actually take control of the moon and try to keep it away from you. Space Wars actually has a similar 2-player mode. When I said it didn't have a 2-player mode, I meant that 2 players aren't competing to shoot things down. But the second player in Space Wars can control some of the enemy ships and make them harder to hit. Not exactly the strongest game. There would be a far stronger version of Starship 1 created by Activision many years later called Star Master, which we talked about in our Activision episode. By then, with more memory and better programming tricks, it was more possible to do something like this halfway decently. Mr. Whitehead is a talented programmer. It's just the system and the techniques were not really up to it in 1977. The next 2 games, not much to really say about them. At this time, we've talked about this in some of our other early console episodes, there was this idea that you had to make a console appeal to the entire family. It's a major purchase. It's very expensive. So you have to justify that purchase with mom and dad, with it not necessarily just being frivolous games for the kids. The main way that was done back on all of the early systems, the Atari VCS was not the only one to do this, was to include some games that were considered more adult games that could be fun for the whole family, and to include some stuff that had educational value, because then you could argue that little Johnny is getting something out of it other than just bouncing a ball around all day. Our next game that we're looking at very briefly
It's one of Bender's favorite games.
which of course means it is Blackjack. CX 2651. Not really going to go into detail on this one. I mean, there are some variations on it and all of that, but it's a blackjack game. Bob Whitehead did it. I lied when I said Larry Kaplan was the only one who managed to do 2 games. Bob Whitehead was also hired fairly early on, so he was also able to do 2 games at launch. This one he picked just because he thought a gambling game would be widely appealing, and you're always trying to have some games that'll appeal to more than just the kids to justify the cost, as I said. It used the paddle controllers just because it could. There's really no advantage to using the joystick versus paddle on a blackjack game like this. It's just they want to justify including those paddle controllers in the box, so if a game can use the paddle controllers, it might as well use them. This, of course, does mean that you can have more than 2 players playing, which is nice, so Blackjack can actually support up to 3 players. There are a few different variants that are based on different types of rules, using Vegas rules versus just regular Blackjack rules. It does have an end state. It's not just a game where you play Blackjack forever. The player wins the game if they end up taking in 1,000 chips. They lose the game if they go completely broke. There is a way to quote-unquote beat the game, though obviously it's just playing blackjack. There wasn't a lot of time for Whitehead to do variants on this one. I think he ran out of time. After all, he was doing Starship, which was a little difficult, and he was hired a little later than Kaplan was. He had originally hoped to include other casino games on this as well as additional variants. He quite simply just ran out of time to do that, which is why he did create a game called Casino for the system a little later that added a few other games on it. That's Blackjack. It exists. Our next one is that token educational game that you always had to have on those early systems. CX 2661. Who knows what the numbers even mean anymore? Basic math. It's addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. It was written by a guy named Gary Palmer who didn't stay around. Like all of the other dedicated programmers that were hired in the beginning went on to long, illustrious careers. Ed Riddle didn't, but he was never a programmer to begin with and wasn't really interested in video games. Gary Palmer, we don't really know much about. He joined after Kaplan and Whitehead. Our understanding is that he spent some of his time developing real development systems for the VCS to make the programming task easier for his fellow programmers, so that's a good thing. And then he just created this very basic math game. There are 2 game modes. It's addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. One set of game modes is timed, with the difficulty switch changing the amount of time. The other just throws random problems at you. You can either have it do 2-digit numbers or 1-digit numbers, depending on the difficulty. Single digit, you have the 12-second timer. 2-digit number, you have the 24-second timer. Yeah, there are game modes where you choose the top number and it gives you a random bottom number, or it chooses both numbers. It's just addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Moving on.
But I wanted to do long-form square root.
Well, aren't you just a precocious little Jeffrey then?
Yes, kids, you can do long-form square roots. They just don't teach it in school anymore.
You just get addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, and you'll like it. So yeah, not much to say. And then our final game, last and almost certainly least, because it was offered with $5 rebates very quickly after it came out, which means it probably didn't sell well. The game Surround, CX 2641. Surround was the first game created by Alan Miller. He and Gary Palmer joined at the same time as the 3rd and 4th programmers. Alan Miller, of course, ended up not just being one of the co-founders of Activision, but was one of the driving forces behind Activision. And he and Bob Whitehead, of course, after that founded Accolade. So a lot of distinguished people in this first group here. Surround is basically just Blockade. Blockade was a game that was released by Gremlin Industries in 1976, created by Lane Houck. One of the very early microprocessor games, not the first one, just one of the very early ones, and a predecessor of the modern Snake game, where basically each player has a cursor, it draws lines on the screen, and if you hit one of the lines on the screen, whether it's the other player's or your own, you crash, and the other player scores a point. So the idea is to draw lines in such a way that your opponent crashes and you don't. We haven't talked about Blockade much yet because I'm waiting to talk about Gremlin Industries until Ethan Johnson, friend of the show, finally gets his book on Gremlin released through Limited Run Press. Hopefully later this year, early next year. I don't know. He's done writing it. He's just waiting for them to have time to publish it. So we haven't done a Gremlin Industries episode yet, and we're going to stay away from them here as well. But basically, Blockade caused a brief sensation at the 1976 MOA show. Then it was heavily copied by all of the bigger companies in the business that were more established than Gremlin, including Atari, who released a version called Dominoes. Then it turned out that the public didn't find it very interesting. After all of that hullabaloo at the MOA show, it ended up just not being all that successful, and everyone forgot about it. It was an arcade game. There was an Atari version of it, Dominoes, so it was an Atari arcade game that nobody else had done yet. So Alan Miller was given Surround to do. It plays pretty much like Blockade does in its basic form, drawing lines on the screen, trying not to crash. There's some interesting game variations on that basic theme, like forcing the players to speed up every few seconds, which means that the game gets more dangerous and more high stakes the longer it goes on. There's a race version, where if you hold down the button on the joystick, you can actually stop your trail from forming for a while, which allows you to backtrack in a way that you normally can't in the game. There's a wraparound option that allows you to go from one end of the screen and wrap around to the other side of the screen. And of course, you can mix all of these things up in various ways. The difficulty switches in this case determine whether you can do a 180, just reverse and go back in the exact same direction that you started from. Obviously, in the modes where you crash, you wouldn't want to do that, but in the erase gameplay modes, you could theoretically backtrack in that way, and difficulty switch indicates whether you can do that or not. Then there is also a drawing version, just a free-form drawing version, because, hey, you can draw lines on the screen. It's kind of like an Etch-a-Sketch. So there's a video graffiti mode that allows you to just draw lines on the screen. As I said, by 1978, they were already offering it at a rebate to customers to purchase the system, which implies that it didn't sell all of that well, though it was decently reviewed in some of the magazines at the time. I've been very bad. Blackjack only has one name, the one game that Sears didn't give a separate name to. Basic Math is just math at Sears, and Surround is known as Chase. So that's it, Jeffrey. Those are the launch titles for the Atari VCS. All of them simple, some of them funner than others, some of them just filler to make the parents feel better about purchasing the system. But a nice variety and still generally better than what the competition had on the market at the time, particularly with the ability to do all of these variants. The competition was often doing games that were of similar complexity to the VCS, but they didn't have all of these game modes. And in a few years, that didn't matter so much when recreating Space Invaders or recreating Pac-Man or Defender or whatever became the most important thing on home systems. Having game variants didn't matter very much. But in this early stage, it really did set them apart because it allowed you to have some interesting twists, whether it be billiards, tank, where you have to bank shot your opponent, or surround, where you can do the erase mode to backtrack. It provided some ways to get a little more fun out of some of these games that were otherwise very simple, and mostly got the Atari VCS off on the right foot, though obviously with the exception of combat, most of these games were quickly forgotten and replaced in people's hearts by the much better games that came out later. Some of those we've talked about on our Activision episode. As for the rest, those will have to wait for a different episode.
So you're telling me we're going to have to cover more Atari games?
Yeah, we probably will at some point. We'll probably do some other batches at some point, but not right now. We're not doing this as a 2 or a 3-parter. Launch titles are perfectly sufficient. As these are simple games that get old if you play them too long, so too would it get very old to just do 5 episodes on them in a row. Though if you like that kind of thing, Kevin Bunch does a great job of it. I'm not being facetious there. His episodes are all very interesting. He doesn't just go into the games and the gameplay themselves, but he goes into a lot of the history surrounding the creation of the games and the influences of the games as well. All very good stuff.
They come with pretty pictures, too.
Indeed.
Well then, since we are done mining Atari yet again, what shall we go into in our next episode?
Well, Jeffrey, you know me. I like myself a good corporate shenanigan.
Oh, dear God.
It hasn't been that long since our last corporate shenanigan episode on Virgin Games. But it's been long enough. We've done a few things in between that are not corporate shenanigans. So I want to look at another one of these French companies that got involved in the kind of gold rush in the telecommunications deregulation.com boom of the late 1990s, which is Vivendi. Not really going into super history on the actual games Vivendi did, but kind of looking at how Vivendi games came together and then how it was broken up, because it involves some wildness around Sierra and Davidson and Associates and Blizzard and all of these companies that is just delightful to tell. So it's going to be a high-level view. It's not going to be the same kind of inside look we did on Virgin Games, where we were talking about a lot of games and stuff as well. This is just going to be a corporate shenanigans episode, because sometimes, Jeffrey, I need to do an episode for me. Most of these are for the fans. This one's for me.
But Alex, we actually finally get to touch on that Vivendi company that we've talked about so many times in so many other contexts, and we actually get to understand where they came from instead of these little asides about, and that Vivendi person came in and bought them, and then shenanigans happened, and then moving on.
That's right. This will be all shenanigans all of the time. Probably our most shenaniganiest episode ever. I'm so sorry / you're welcome, depending on where you stand.
So get your alcohol out, or get your bets in for how shenanigan-y this gets in our next episode on They Create Worlds. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where we have linked to some of the things that we discussed in this and other episodes. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, The Story of the People and Companies That Shaped the Video Game Industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Feel free to email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworlds. If you do sign up, please do so through the website and not through the iOS app. This saves you from the 30% Apple markup. We understand that you may not be able to financially support us, but you can still support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcasting service that you use. We now have the podcast available on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License. Outro music is Bacterial Love by Roll Music, found at freemusicarchive.org, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License. This episode is brought to you by live streaming the editing process for over 4 or 5 hours. I've lost track at this point. Thank you all who decided to hang out with me for a bit and learn how the sausage is made.